twin centers of a previously unimagined source of power. Another man, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, saw the new danger and warned of it to no avail. After Stimson, dozens would sound alarms as the Pentagon usurped controls over the levers of the American economy and culture, over science, academia, and politics. Disastrous rise is Dwight Eisenhower's phrase, from his farewell address warning of what he dubbed the military-industrial complex. The Pentagon has been so much at the center of national life that one could write an entire history of the contemporary United States in its terms. Our subject, though, concerns more simply the ways in which the accumulation of Pentagon power effected what amounted to a mutation in the meaning of American power. Nuclear weapons informed the tale from start to finish, but more as the gods of a new religion than as mere instruments of war. Anti-communism gives that religion its first theology and its first heresy hunt. But America's bipolar mindset survives the disappearance of communism as the Cold War bleeds into the global war on terror, with evil making its stunning comeback in the new century and appeals to religion becoming more overt than ever. Always, the Pentagon remains the nation's sacred temple. At the same time, the Pentagon remains an engine room, generating a current that flows inexorably toward the edge of an abyss, until, finally, the Pentagon becomes the bullseye of a world target. Mostly, though, the Pentagon's is a story of ordinary people who acted with good intentions, faced tragic dilemmas, and resisted what they saw happening right in front of them. One of those was my father. I have the eyes of a soldier's son, through which, unfortunately, I see everything. This audio program travels a path through a forest of questions, the Pentagon itself a kind of dark woods. A child's questions have become a man's. Part 1. 1 week in 1943. Chapter 1. Hell's Bottom. A year after the Al-Qaeda attack, at a rededication ceremony on September 11th, 2002, much was made of the post-9/11 repairs having been completed in a mere 12 months. No one seemed to know that the entire building had been constructed from start to finish in less than 16 months. Relatively little steel was used in the construction, those ramps instead of elevators, because it was needed just then for bullets, shells, and tanks. Planners took for granted that the hulking edifice would eventually be handed over for civilian use. Before the Pentagon, the War Department alone occupied 17 separate facilities around Washington. To consolidate the offices in one handsome place, President Roosevelt had personally overseen the construction of a new headquarters in Foggy Bottom. But no sooner was it completed than World War II broke out. The new headquarters was instantly inadequate. The building would become the headquarters of the State Department, which it remains to this day. Senior military officials immediately began scouting new building sites outside Washington. Considering the architect's plans for the hulking structure, FDR ordered the size of the building reduced by half. He also affirmed that after the present emergency, the War Department headquarters would be returned to Washington. No permanent headquarters building would be necessary. When the general in charge of the project objected to these terms, the president said, "My dear General, I'm still Commander-in-Chief of the Army." The general complied, but only partially. The new site was found, an unsightly shack-ridden wasteland called Hell's Bottom. But without Roosevelt's knowledge, the general declined to reduce the size of the building. The original design called for a simple rectangular footprint, but access roads required one corner of the rectangle to be cut off, leaving an asymmetrical five-sided building. Eventually, others would mythologize the form as an echo of Napoleonic-era fortress architecture. The true, entirely mundane origin of the design would be forgotten. Pearl Harbor was attacked almost 3 months after groundbreaking, and from then on, an already quickened pace of construction was redoubled. "How big should I make that beam across the 3rd floor?" one architect asked another, who replied, "I don't know, they installed it yesterday." Supervising all of this work, was a Corps of Engineers colonel named Leslie R. Groves. In charge of the Army's crash building program across the country, he had already purchased half the lumber in the United States. As the Pentagon neared completion, Groves was promoted to brigadier general, although for a reason having to do with his next project, not this one. Among his last decisions in Arlington was one that provided the new building with separate accommodations for colored people. When President Roosevelt visited the building shortly before its dedication, he asked why there were so many lavatories, more than 200, and he was told that the Army was abiding by Virginia's racial laws. Roosevelt told Groves to get rid of the whites-only signs at once. Groves obeyed. Because he was overridden by the president, the Pentagon would, for a long time, be the only place in Virginia where segregation was not allowed. Within days of Roosevelt's visit to the new War Department headquarters, at an understated ceremony presided over by Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, the Pentagon was dedicated. It was January 15, 1943. Chapter 2. Unconditional Surrender. Franklin Roosevelt was not present at the dedication because he had flown to Casablanca, Morocco. He was in the midst of an 8-day meeting with Prime Minister Winston Churchill and General Charles de Gaulle, chief of the Fighting French. Joseph Stalin was not present because Soviet armies were just then throwing back the Germans at Leningrad. At the same time, Stalin's forces were about to complete the destruction of the German army at Stalingrad. Armed now with the initiative, Stalin would be driven as much by revenge as by strategy, and his allies would have to accommodate it. At Casablanca, General Dwight Eisenhower was given command of the unified North African forces, and on January 23rd, the Eighth Army conquered Tripoli. By January 1943, the war in the Pacific had turned its corner, too. The Japanese had been defeated at the Battle of the Coral Sea and at Midway, where the Japanese lost control of the Pacific. And after the American conquest of Guadalcanal in August, one island after another fell as the Japanese began a steady retreat. Allied victory became a matter of when, rather than if. Roosevelt reflected this assurance at Casablanca when, overriding the instincts of Churchill, he insisted on defining the Allied war aim for the first time as the unconditional surrender of the Axis. The conference deliberated on the subject, but owing to differences, there was no agreed plan to issue a declaration. Roosevelt then spontaneously used the phrase in the post-conference press briefing, claiming later that it was unintentional. Churchill recounts this in his memoir, then adds sarcastically, "I do not feel that this frank statement is in any way weakened by the fact that the phrase occurs in the notes from which he spoke." That Roosevelt and Churchill differed on this question may reflect nothing more than a pervasive difference between the New World and the Old. But even in America, the tradition was less than absolute. Ulysses S. Grant had not insisted on unconditional surrender with Robert E. Lee at Appomattox. The conditions of the World War I armistice were harsh, but they were still conditions. What haunted Roosevelt was that World War I had ended without the permanent destruction of Germany's capacity to recover as a war-waging nation. It is also likely that Roosevelt was trying to mollify Stalin, who was increasingly impatient for a British-American invasion of Europe. The Western Allies' nightmare was that the Soviets would enter into a separate peace with Berlin, as happened in World War I. The unconditional surrender demand was a signal to the Soviet leader that his allies were not going to do any such thing themselves. Churchill had spent the century up to his elbows in the blood of Britain's imperial wars. That was the experience he was drawing on. He knew that by foreclosing any possible negotiations towards surrender, the Allies were making it more likely that the Axis powers would fight to the bitter end. This was so because unconditional surrender could be taken by an enemy as promising the destruction not just of its armies, but of its whole society. It meant the enemy would have no reason to mitigate the ferocity of its resistance. Ironically, Roosevelt would learn at Tehran 10 months after Casablanca that Stalin, whom he had hoped to encourage with the demand of unconditional surrender, was completely opposed to it. Even the harshest conditions, Stalin argued, would bring about a settlement far sooner than none at all. Stalin's army, imposing itself unconditionally in the war's last months, would lose 1 million more.